this is my speech for Introduction to Oral Communication for the informative speech. So today we're going to start out with an example. Let's say that you're part of a multinational corporation and you're currently in a meeting with a Taiwanese colleague. The conversation seems productive, but you're never quite sure where they stand on the subject. Later, a German colleague of yours informs you that the Taiwanese coworker of yours was expecting you to read between the lines during your meeting. In contrast, that German colleague seemed to have no problem giving it to you straight, despite it being a little bit uncomfortable. These examples highlight an interesting point. Many cultures have different ways of communicating context, and understanding these differences can have a big impact. Today, we will be exploring high context cultures, which rely heavily on nonverbal cues and situational context, and low context cultures, which prioritize direct and explicit communication to better understand these aspects in our personal and professional interactions. We will start by defining high and low context communications, looking at some examples from different cultures, and finish by examining how these styles impact our interactions. High and low context styles sit on the opposite ends of how people express and understand messages. For high context communication, a lot of meaning comes from shared experiences and what's not actually said. As Stella Toomey in her book writes, communicating across cultures, high context relies a lot on indirect verbal cues, subtle nonverbal signals, and interpreter-sensitive values. Simply put, what isn't being said can be just as important as what isn't being said, sometimes more so. On the other hand, low context communication is all about being direct and clear, using specific language. Toomey writes in her book as well that low context communication is often straightforward, focusing on delivering the message as effectively as possible. In this style, the priority is getting to the point quickly and ensuring both parties understand each other clearly. Now that we've covered the basics of high and low context communication, let's look at some cultures that use these styles. Different cultures around the world generally favor one style over the other. For example, East Asian cultures like China lean towards high context communication. In his book, Beyond Culture, Edward T. Hall, the father of this concept, explains China's long history and deep cultural roots have created a society where the surrounding context around a conversation is often more important than the words being spoken. In contrast, Hall notes that American culture is more low context, but not the most extreme. He states that people like the German and the Scandinavians are even more direct and prefer contexting as little as possible in their day-to-day life. European cultures are often like this because of how their cultures, languages, and borders have changed over the millennia compared to East Asian cultures, for example. While many cultures tend to lean towards one side or the other, it's important to note that it's not always a black and white situation. However, when these two styles clash, it can seem that way. High and low context communication styles can create tension in our interactions, especially in the workplace. For instance, someone from a high context culture may find a low context person's directness rude, while in return the low context person might see that high context person as vague or evasive, which mirrors the scenario we talked about in the beginning. It can get even trickier when communication happens online. In their book, Intercultural Communication and Context, Martin and Nakayama note that when low context and high context people interact online, the lack of contextual cues, that is, tone of voice, eye gaze, and facial expressions, can make the interaction difficult. The low context person may feel comfortable being direct online, while the high context person may struggle without those usual contextual clues. And the differences don't just affect the workplace, they also show up in our personal interactions. Small things can easily be misinterpreted when high and low context people interact. Martin and Nakayama also note how many cultures have small cues that can mean different things to someone outside their sphere, or potentially nothing at all. It all depends on the context and if the other person knows how to interpret it or cares to. So, in summary, we've explored the differences between high and low context communication styles, how they work, and which cultures use them, as well as how these styles can impact both our professional and personal interactions. As our world becomes more connected, recognizing and adapting these different styles is essential. Whether the message is wrapped in layers of context or delivered to you straight, understanding why this is can help us navigate cultural differences and avoid misunderstandings.